Welcome, everybody. We'd like to welcome you wherever you are, whichever time zone you're in, and we are so grateful that you are here with us at Compassion Institute for this very special webinar with Dr. Shireen Mansouri. I would like to just let you know that I'm Stephen Butler, Executive Director for Compassion Institute. Our mission at Compassion Institute is to advocate for compassion as a guiding principle and an active force in making a kinder world. We do that through our work of developing and delivering programs to individuals and institutions to develop the muscle of compassion. So leading us today in our webinar is Program Manager for our health program, Jonathan Ayala. I'm going to turn it over to him and he'll get us into this wonderful event. Thank you, Jonathan.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen. And welcome, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us. Before we begin, we'd love to know where everyone is calling in from. So if you could do us a favor and answer three questions, you can put it in the chat. And those three are, where are you joining us from? City, country, state, whatever you feel comfortable with. Number two, what is your relation to healthcare? Are you a physician, a nurse, patient advocate, community health worker, etc.? Three, if you have any experience with compassion training. So if you could just drop those in the chat, it'll be nice to see who's in the house this afternoon for us here in California. But we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Jonathan Ayala. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the health program manager for the Compassion Institute. I'm super excited about the health team's first webinar for the year. But before we jump in, just a couple of quick notes. Number one, the session is being recorded, and so you will be able to access it afterward on our YouTube page and on the Compassion Institute website. Secondly, we will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. So as they come up, just write them down. You can feel free to put those in the chat during the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. So just an FYI on that. And finally, we also have a key takeaway document that we'll be making available publicly to everybody for free. And that'll be on our CI website, and we'll drop the link to that at the end of the session as well. So just some things to look out for. Great. So I'm going to jump in because we have a lot to get to, wonderful content to get to today. I'm going to welcome today's presenter. Dr. Shireen Mansouri is the health content lead for Compassion Institute's health team. She's here to discuss connecting with patients using compassion-based skills. So I'm going to let Shireen introduce herself a little bit more and go into her background. So I'm going to hand it off to her. So, Shireen.
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. So hopefully that is now visible. Uh-oh.
Yep.
Is it?
Yep. Yeah, it's good. We're good.
Okay. I am going to, sorry, I am just playing with my speaker view, which I am having some difficulty with. So my apologies.
No worries.
Sorry about this. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and get out of this.
And well,
yeah, sorry, Jonathan, do you want to just read out what are some of the things that you're seeing in the chat?
Yeah, for sure. So we have some folks from Houston, Texas. Welcome, Texas. Newport Beach, California, Florida. We have some CNAs as well in the house. We have social work students. I see Boise, Idaho, medical interpreter. So folks from near and far.
Fantastic. Okay, great. I think I'm good now.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so welcome everybody. My name is Shireen Mansouri. I'm a family physician that is living and practicing in Canada. And I am the health content lead for Compassion Institute and a certified compassion cultivation training teacher. And I do have a specific interest in looking at compassion in healthcare and what are the things that can get in the way and how can we enable more of it? Because we know that this is what we want to be doing in healthcare, but it's not always the easiest. So we're going to start by a short settling meditation, because this is what we're here to talk about is contemplative care. I'm going to invite everybody to take a seat, find a comfortable seat. If it's available to you, you may want to close your eyes or drop your gaze. And we're going to settle into this moment, taking 3 deep breaths. I invite you to take a deep breath in, filling up your lungs, your torso, and then letting it out slowly. Another deep breath and out. And another third very deep breath. And when you let it out, you might even want to let it out as a complete sigh. And then letting your breathing just drop into its normal rhythm. And as we arrive in this space, I'm going to invite you to leave behind everything that's already happened today, putting aside everything that still needs to be done. Just knowing that we're taking this time to be here together with the intention of bringing more compassion into the world. Bringing that compassion into the world around us and then allowing it to ripple out. Taking another breath or two, and then slowly, when you're ready, turning your attention back into this space. Okay, and welcome. So again, for those that are just joining us, if you want to drop into the chat where you're joining us from, your relationship to healthcare and any experience with compassion training, it'd be great. So what am I going to do today? I'm going to review the what and the why of compassion. I'm going to outline 3 concepts that I've been using to inform the more in the moment compassion practices I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to review some practices that we can use in our day to day, and then really wanting to have enough time for some question and answer. So the lens I want to bring to this is as well the fact that a lot of you you're tuning in because you're already interested in this. And you are likely already doing a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about. A lot of this might not be new to you, but thinking about the fact that we're going to name what we're doing, understand why we're doing it, um, and then thinking about how do we model this and teach this to others? So thinking about that ripple and how can we bring these practices out and have them come out to others. The other thing that I want to just mention is I'm a physician. I will be using the word patient. I realize a lot of people use the word client, so you can just substitute that in your head as we go along. So the other thing that I want to talk about, this quote really resonates with me. I'm a family physician. I did start my career as an emergency medicine physician. I could fix a lot of things. I could sew up cuts and set bones. But now as a family physician, there's less curing. And sometimes I can't even completely relieve the suffering, but I can always comfort. And for me, this is my why. Uh, and I think for everybody, knowing what your why is in healthcare, why we're showing up every day is really important. I've started to think more and more about, what if my goal is to make each and every person I'm in contact with feel safe? What if that's my main goal? So I want us to carry that thought through today. So what is compassion? Compassion is basically an awareness that somebody is suffering, a sense of concern and caring about that suffering, and a deep, deep desire to relieve the suffering. Um, the short form for me is to journey with. It comes from the Latin to be with someone suffering. And this idea of journeying alongside somebody, for me, always brings back to mind exactly what I'm doing with compassion. The other thing is it's innate in all of us. It can be cultivated, and it's very relational. It's not something that can be done necessarily in isolation. Why do we care about it in healthcare? I mean, that seems like an obvious question. Of course, we care about it in healthcare. But what's important is how do we explain this to others? How do we explain that this is not just a nice to, but a must have? And there are more and more studies out there now showing there's reduction in need for opioids for people during and after surgery if they feel that they have received compassionate care. Uh, Patients after trauma, if they've received compassionate care, have a better outcome. There's longer survival in palliative care, lower odds of complications with those living with diabetes. People living with HIV have a higher likelihood of having an undetectable viral load. And there's greater adherence to cancer screening guidelines for patients that feel that they have received compassionate care, decreased test ordering and referral to specialists. So this is actually good for our system and it saves money. As anybody who's read the book Compassionomics knows, there is an economic argument for this. The other thing is this slide is to remind me to talk about how it's all within an ecosystem. So there's the patient that's experiencing hopefully compassionate care from their provider, a provider or clinician that is hopefully experiencing compassion from their organization, and that this all happens in this larger ecosystem of teams and organizations. And we can talk a lot about organizational compassion, but today I'm going to really focus on the clinician, that moment in your day when you're with the patient or before you're about to go see the patient. Um, so of the theories that I'm going to talk about, the first one is the polyvagal theory. And this is this idea that at any given moment, our nervous systems are looking for cues of safety or threat. And when we feel safe, we're in this green zone of regulation. Um, and we can feel calm, connected, and regulated. And when we start to feel threat, we can either go into this hyperarousal fight or flight mode, or we can actually shut down, where we can feel numb, we disconnect, and we just can't take anything in. And what's important is that it's really our ability to access compassion is strongest when we're in that regulation zone. So for us to feel compassion, it's important to have an element of regulation. We may not completely be in regulation, but have elements of regulation. There's also studies again, in healthcare showing that people who are in regulation or that are having positive affect are more creative, are quicker to come to clinical decisions, more likely to be accurate in their clinical decisions. And a study done with anesthetists, those that are feeling positive affect are less likely to be subject to anchoring. They're more likely to see things happening and changing with their patients. And again, clinicians are less likely, that are feeling positive affect, are more likely to write fewer prescriptions and spend more time with their patients. So this translates, this idea of feeling positive affect, feeling regulated translates into better clinical care. Now, during my day, I know that for the most part, I'm probably most likely to end up in fight or flight. And there are ways that we can activate our vagal nerves to bring us back into regulation. So some of those ways are with breathing, like we did at the beginning of this webinar, is specifically elongating the out breath. There's some neck and jaw stretches we can do. Being in nature and being around animals are all ways that we can regulate and bring ourselves into that vagal space. And these are things we can be doing with our patients as well during the day. So we can do it for ourselves, but we can also do it with other people. The second concept I want to talk about is this idea of co-regulation, which just really comes out of the polyvagal theory. And it's this idea that when we're in relationship with another person, not only are we in either regulation or not, but they're also in one of those states and we're affecting each other. So I think of this as the being versus the doing of healthcare. And so we think about where am I at any given time and where is the person that I am dealing with? And how am I affecting them? How am I being affected by them, and how am I affecting them? And there are more and more studies showing that this is happening on a neurophysiological level. There's heart rate variability effects. There was one interesting study where they looked at clinicians that silently did loving kindness for their patients compared to clinicians who didn't. And there was an effect on the patient's heart rate variability. The patient didn't even know what was happening and that the clinician was doing the loving kindness meditation, and yet their heart rate variability was affected by it. So there is this unspoken regulation that's happening, and we can be um, affecting the person that we're with um, more than just with what we're saying. And then the last piece is this idea that compassion does not fatigue. And this is taken from the neurophysiological and fMRI studies that they've done on empathy and compassion. Briefly said, when someone is in empathy, what's happening is that the fight or flight aspect of their brain is being lit up. And if you move into this compassion space, this wanting to relieve, this wanting to do something to relieve the suffering, this actually then activates the tend and befriend aspects of your brain. And you start to get oxytocin, dopamine, progesterone, feel-good hormones actually being seen within the physiology of the person. And so the way I think of it is that you can have empathy for somebody's suffering. This can push you into this fight or flight or shutdown. You can be dysregulated. And if you stay dysregulated, this causes what's called empathic distress, which is probably the better term for compassion fatigue. And this will shut you down. You're going to want to protect yourself, and you will eventually end up leading to burnout. Whereas if we can bring ourselves into regulation, but stay with this suffering, stay with the difficult emotions, this can activate the empathic concern, move into compassion, and allow us to be more pro-social, reach out, and actually want to help the person and extend that compassion. Um, and then the last thing I want to talk about before we get into the in the moment practices is this idea of formal versus informal practice. So formal practice is really important. However, we know that it's not always accessible to everybody at all times. And informal practices are turning out to be just as important. There was a study I found that showed that the frequency in formal practice is actually more associated with well-being and cognitive flexibility than the formal mindfulness practice. So the more we can bring this into our day, in fact, the better it's going to affect our well-being. This same study talked about like how can you sustain this formal practice or the informal practices. And some of the things that they talked about were basically the knowledge and the belief in the benefits. So the more we believe that it's useful, the more we're going to do it. Support from others and having community. So not doing this silently by ourselves, but actually having people that we talk to about it and do it with. Cues in the environment, things that remind us to do them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then time and routine. So making it a regular part of our day. So the other thing I'm going to talk about is just the steps of compassion, the way I think of them, because this is going to inform how I go through the practices. So always starting with awareness, we need to be aware of the suffering in order to want to do something about it, this concern or connection with the person, a desire to relieve, a belief that we can make a difference, a willingness to act to relieve. And finally, this warm glow, or what's called compassion satisfaction. So once we have extended compassion, again, it has activated this tend and befriend aspect in our brain, and we can feel a warm glow from it. And this is what makes it this positive feedback loop that we actually want to do this again, over and over again. And the other important thing is that the belief I can make a difference, it might not be necessarily fixing, but it could be being with the person. And I also always want to remember that we can't always cure, but we can always comfort and help relieve. So I've just talked a lot. I've put a lot of things out there. I'm going to invite people just to take a moment and feel into your body right now. Do you notice anything? What are you feeling? And let's take a breath together. And we're going to come into the present moment again. And I'm going to talk about mindfulness. And remembering that the definition of mindfulness is this non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. It is what it is. And I don't need to judge it in any way. I also want to debunk mindfulness a little bit. In the healthcare field, it's become a bit of a dirty word. And there's some things that I want to talk about it. So the first piece is that it's about noticing, but not eliminating the thoughts. It's about just noticing our thoughts in this non-judgmental way, because I think a lot of people feel that it's just emptying our brains and eliminating the thoughts, and then we feel like it's not accessible to us. But it's just about noticing them. The second piece is that it can lead, the more we practice this mindfulness or this present moment awareness, it can lead to more cognitive flexibility, which I think of as making things less sticky. So as I move from patient to patient, from room to room, I'm less likely to be affected about what's just happened and more likely to be present in the moment. And then there's this idea of using mindfulness as a diagnostic tool. And I'm taking this from Wendy Dean, and I'll put the reference in the takeaway document. She works a lot with moral injury. But she talks about mindfulness as a diagnostic tool for what's wrong with the healthcare system. And I'm going to quote her. What would happen if clinicians flipped the script on mindfulness and instead of using it to tolerate a broken system, used it to sharpen an awareness of the challenges? Like mindfulness jujitsu, clinicians could use the training being offered by many institutions not to accept the status quo, but to fix it. So again, this is not a panacea, but another tool in our toolbox to help create a better system. So how do we practice this in the moment? And I think of it using these three pieces of an intention, attention, and attitude. So our intention, what is going to be our mindfulness bell? What is going to be the thing that's going to remind us that we actually want to bring ourselves back into the moment? And this can be, my favorite one is using my log on as the computer's logging on, or I'm watching that little thing go around on the screen, and I could get really frustrated with it. Is that my moment to bring myself back to the present moment? Could it be washing my hands? Could it be as I'm listening to somebody? I heard somebody once say in the emergency department, the first thing they try to do is notice the eye color of each person they're interacting with. Could it be attention on my feet as I walk from room to room? The second piece will be, where am I putting my attention? How am I going to bring myself back into the moment? Am I going to use my breath? Am I going to use my body, such as feeling my feet on the ground? Or am I going to use a mantra, something like this too? And then the last piece is just this attitude and remembering that it's all about not being judgmental. So when I forget to do it, haven't done it in days, not judging myself for that and just going, okay, I'm going to start again. The next thing I'm going to talk about is intention setting. And in order to bring compassion into our day, it's back to we want to do it. And this is an easy one for this group. Everybody tuned in today, so clearly you're interested in this. So I'm going to invite you to just take a moment and bring your thoughts back to why you tuned in today or why you're watching this recording. What is your why for wanting to bring compassion back into what you do every day? And how do we practice this? We can recall our intention either at the start of our day, first thing in the morning as we're getting up or as we start our clinic day. Or maybe it's right before a patient encounter, or maybe it's right before a difficult interaction or a difficult meeting that we're going to go into. The next thing I'm going to talk about is this idea of presence or listening. I like to quote Naomi Rachel Remen and her idea of generous listening. Shane Sinclair, who's a professor of nursing out of Calgary, does a lot of work in the compassion space and talks about this idea of confronting and presence as being parts of compassion in healthcare. And this quote I love, this listening requires a letting go of our self-agenda. To listen is to lean in softly with a willingness to be changed by what we hear. So how often are we letting go of any preconceptions and allowing ourselves to be changed by what we hear? And this is just, again, remembering that people want to be seen and not heard. So how can we practice this? I always think about this idea that often clinicians will be interrupting patients before they're done. I think it's down to 11 seconds at the last study that I read. So what would happen if we just listened to somebody until they were done speaking? And I often challenge people to do this at least once a day, if not more, and just see what happens. Listening to a friend or colleague without trying to fix. I think in healthcare, so often we're trying to fix something. We're thinking about all the solutions as we're listening to them. But what if we actually listen to them without trying to fix anything? I'm going to move now to self-compassion. And I think there's been a lot of talk about self-compassion. Again, many webinars have been done on self-compassion. We could talk for ages about this. Why am I bringing this into a talk about what we can be doing with patients in the moment? Why are we bringing our self-compassion into this? So first of all, a definition of self-compassion, I like to keep it really simple, basically including ourselves into the circle of compassion. So as we want to spread compassion out into the world, why not just have ourselves be part of this? Another really simple way of thinking about it is treating ourselves as we would a good friend. So when we're suffering, thinking about, what would a good friend say to me, instead of what it is that I'm necessarily saying to myself. And a really important piece of this is that self-compassion doesn't have to be done in isolation. There is this aspect of receiving compassion from others and noticing when somebody is extending us compassion, and can we notice that and can we accept it? When I first went through compassion teacher training, there's discussion of the fact that you don't have to have self-compassion to have compassion for others. And I think that stands to a certain degree. I think it's hard to make compassion sustainable if we don't have self-compassion. And we are starting to see research now showing that people with more self-compassion are able to extend compassion to others more. There was a study recently showing that patients who felt like if you looked at patients who felt like they received compassionate care, and then you looked at the nurses that had extended the compassion, the nurses that had more self-compassion were able to extend more compassion to their patients, and their patients felt it more. So there is this knock-on effect. So that's why I'm bringing it into this conversation. I'm also bringing it into the idea that when we're in regulation, we can extend compassion more effectively. And it's hard to be in regulation if we're not being self-compassionate. So this idea of, being our own coach instead of a critic, if we're constantly beating up on ourselves, are we bringing ourselves out of regulation? And what do we need to come back into regulation? In compassion cultivation training, we talk about the compassionate image practice, and there will be an example of this in your takeaway sheet where we can use this practice to help access a larger form of compassion and help bring ourselves into regulation. And then I just love this quote from Richard Wagamese. What do I do when I don't like who I am? Hang out with people who do like who you are. So this is this idea that compassion is relational, even self-compassion, and accessing compassion from others can be part of bringing ourselves um, into regulation. So what are some of those practical things that we can do during the day? The first one is asking when I'm feeling uncomfortable or I notice my own suffering, what do I need right now? What do I need to bring myself into regulation? And it can be a very simple answer. Maybe it's just, I need to actually eat my lunch. I need to be hydrated. I need to take a moment. Notice when help is being offered and notice how you react to that. Again, non-judgmentally. Asking for help when you feel like you need it. And maybe think about supporting somebody else's self-compassion or offering to help somebody else. And again, noticing that this is mutual. And again, all of this is non-judgmentally. So when I find myself not being compassionate to myself, don't beat up on myself in order, like, for not being self-compassionate. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is this idea of common humanity. So we're extending this circle of compassion. We're including ourselves in this. We're including others in this. And we're going to be including others that we may not always see eye to eye with, or we may not always agree with. And how do we do this? And in compassion cultivation training, we talk about this just like me practice as being kind of the shorthand for this. So the definition of common humanity is this idea that at a very basic level, we all want to be happy and we don't want to suffer. And I think we can all agree with this, that we know that everybody wants to be happy and not to suffer. And our lives are inextricably interconnected and interdependent. And what this means in common humanity, that as long as somebody else is suffering, it's going to be hard for me to be happy. If somebody else, other people around me are happy, it's more likely that I'm going to be happy. Common humanity is also the antidote to isolation in healthcare. In medicine, we are very good at isolating ourselves, and this is the antidote to that. There's a concept I also want to bring in is this idea of compassion-seeking behavior. So Shane Sinclair, again, out of Calgary, talks about this. That when people are potentially being difficult, and I put this in quote, the difficult person, often that's a compassion-seeking behavior. They're looking for compassion and they're not getting it. The other person who talks about this is Marshall Rosenberg, who talks about nonviolent communication. And he says all unskillful behavior is a tragic expression of an unmet need. So somebody has an unmet core need, and in order to get it met, they are acting out in some way. Unfortunately, how they're acting is not necessarily going to get them what they need. And this comes down to this difference of, I want to be free from suffering, but maybe the way that I have gone about it isn't going to get me there. So this idea of a need versus a strategy. And when we see people that don't seem to be wanting to be free of suffering, it might be just that the strategy they're using to be free of suffering is not working for them, or they've chosen a strategy that's not going to work for them. So with this in mind, what I'd like to do is actually take a minute to take people through a just like me practice that we can be using then during our day. So I'm going to invite people again to close your eyes if you feel comfortable with that, or maybe just drop your gaze, take a breath, let it out, and then bringing to mind somebody that you might come across in your day that you don't necessarily have any special sense of either closeness or conflict with. So this is somebody that you might pass on your way to work, you might see in the cafeteria, a neighbor that you don't necessarily know that well, but you see often. Just notice how you feel when you think about this person. And consider that just like you, this person has had ups and downs in their life. Just like you, this person has goals and dreams. They're an object of deep concern to somebody just like you. They're a child to somebody, or a parent or a spouse. Just like you, they know what pain and sadness, anger and fear feel like. Just like you, they want to be loved. They want to contribute and be appreciated. And with this in mind, silently think to yourself, just like me, this person wishes to be happy and free from suffering. And just say to them, may you be free from this suffering. May you be free from fear and anger. May you be well, and may you know peace and joy. And then dropping that imagery, your eyes were closed, you can slowly open them and come back into this space. It's a very short, just like me, common humanity practice. Again, there'll be a link to a longer one in the takeaway document. So how do we bring this into our day? So that phrase, just like me, using it anytime. I often like to use it at the beginning of a meeting, looking around the room and thinking about that, each person that's sitting around the table. Doing a loving kindness or just like me practice for your day list. So as you look at your list for each person on the list, thinking, may you be free from suffering. May you be free from fear and anger. May you know peace and joy. And for that person that you might be feeling is having that, might be being difficult or having compassion seeking behavior, ask yourself what's their unmet need. So compassion satisfaction, as we get to the last few slides here, remembering that there's this warm glow that comes with compassion satisfaction. And what can we do to actually intensify this? So what are some of the practices that we can do? This picture is the picture of the bell that we installed in our chemotherapy cancer treatment unit in my hospital. This is the bell that people get to ring when they finish their chemotherapy. And it allows us to celebrate a success. The whole team gets together along with the patient and whatever family they have with them, and we can celebrate somebody's success. So can we celebrate with our patients? I have a really ridiculous little dance I do every time somebody tells me that they've quit smoking or even significantly reduced their smoking. Can we accept thanks from people? Notice when it's being extended and can we accept it? And gratitude practice, which again, we could do an entire webinar on gratitude practice, and I have a link to some information there in the takeaway document. And also thinking about how we define success. It doesn't necessarily need to be the full cure, but if we have allowed somebody to feel safe in our presence, maybe that's success. And finally, I want to end with this idea of joy. How can we bring joy into what we're doing every day? And Ross Gay, who's a poet and a writer who talks a lot about joy, has this quote, "We must learn to tend to each other's joy." How can we bring joy into our day, into other people's day? So with that, I think I'm going to finish. I want to end with a dedication. And this I've taken from, and I'm going to, the person's name will have slipped my mind for a moment, but this idea of may I be centered and respectful of myself so that in my way I can contribute to the welfare of others. May we all contribute to safety, and may we all make safety contagious. and may our way of being safe inspire others. So I will now stop my screen share and hopefully get back to a decent view of Jonathan. Great. And we will look at fielding some questions.
Yes, but first, before that, I just got to say thank you so much, Shireen. That was a wonderful presentation. So much good stuff. And we're really, really grateful that you were able to share so much of what you've learned over the years. It was really wonderful. Yes, and so like Shireen said, please, we're going to answer some questions. So as you're formulating them, please put them in the chat, and we'll get to them. But first, I'll just take a point of personal privilege, and I will ask the first question if I can. So you brought up so many different great points, so many wonderful different practices that people can do in that moment, throughout their day, at home. If somebody's watching and they don't necessarily have a compassion cultivation practice or mindfulness practice, what would your advice be for them? How might they be able to kind of jump in? Because I can imagine it would feel a little intimidating if somebody doesn't know where to start. So what advice would you have for them?
Yeah, great question, Jonathan. I think so. In the takeaway document, there's a number of links that I've added. Of course, they're mostly to Compassion Institute resources. We do have a YouTube channel where there are a number of guided practices, and I've added links to the ones that refer to each type of practice that I talked about. So that's one place that we can start. Insight Timer is a great app that has a lot of guided meditations of all sorts. And soon there will be Compassion Institute guided meditations there, but they have thousands of meditations. In terms of the practices I've talked about, as I said, awareness is that foundational piece. And if you pick one practice from today, I would start there, is deciding on, you know, during my day do I want to try and bring myself back into the present moment? What do I want to set as my mindfulness bell? There are apps you can set. I find that they are a bit intrusive, so that's why I've offered other options. And also deciding what it is that I want to do. Is it that breath? Is it just feeling my feet on the ground? Is it a touch point of my hand on the desk or on my lap? And practicing with that. And then the last piece of it is find a community. I think it's so important to have community around this. Uh, I I know I have a number of communities. One of my communities is on WhatsApp, and it's just so great to every day see things that are posted by people that bring me back to that moment and
Mm,
bring me back to why I'm doing these things. So looking around either in your workplace, in your community, your physical community,
mhm.
or a virtual community that you can join, I think is so important.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned sort of mindfulness as a place to start. That kind of echoes that idea of mindfulness as a diagnostic tool, right? So, okay, I need to be aware, see where I want to go, be aware of what else I kind of want to jump into. So, really like that. Um, awesome. Let me just check the chat. If not, I'm going to jump to another one of my questions. Okay, cool. So I have another question. So you talked about interconnectedness, right? And wanting everyone to be happy seems like a wonderful concept. I want to get behind it. The world, however, that world can sometimes feel like out of reach, like more of an ideal world as opposed to the world we live in. So how do we practice just like me, or or any other kind of interconnectedness practice? Um, um, Thinking about folks who we may very much disagree with, or whom we've had not very great experiences with, either in our daily work or just kind of in the general world. Just kind of throwing that easy peasy question to you there.
That's such an easy question, Jonathan. If we could answer that, yes, the world would be a different place.
Right.
I mean, I think I want to start, I do want to start with boundaries and safety,
Hmm.
first of all. Um, Back to, for us to have compassion, we need to feel safe. And so I never want anybody putting themselves in a position where they don't feel safe. And I think, often we go to how do we have compassion for that person that's the hardest for us to have compassion for, and that's not necessarily where we want to start.
Mm,
And we never want to put ourselves in a position where we might be exposing ourselves to harm. So just starting with that. Obviously, in the clinical environment, we will be faced with people where we don't necessarily agree with their views, and we're still having to provide care for them. Um, and I think in that situation, again, making sure that we're always safe. Uh, Coming back to this idea that people themselves are wanting to feel safe. They all have these same basic human needs, but their actions may not be reflecting that. So the actions that they've chosen are likely misguided or are not going to achieve what they want. Separating the action from the person, so understanding that the person themselves, we can have compassion for the person, but not for the action. We can still very much disagree and not condone the action. Um, the other piece to what you're asking, what I think is really interesting in compassion cultivation training, we do the Just Like Me practice, and we'll actually do that practice with somebody that we care deeply about. We'll then do the practice for somebody we feel neutral about, which is the one I
mhm,
led everybody through. And then we'll try the practice with somebody that we find annoying or irritating. Um, and I did see a study recently where they looked at people doing the practice just for neutral people, and they didn't actually have them doing the practice for somebody that they felt was difficult in their lives. And just by doing the practice for neutral people, they found that over time, they still were able to relate to people that were difficult in their lives in a more compassionate way.
mm,
So we don't need to push ourselves to doing a lot of practice around the person that's difficult for us. If we just stick to the neutral, that will expand our circle of compassion in and of itself. So those are a few things that I think about to that question.
yeah. I mean, I think that that's really great to know in the sense of it's a skill, right? And if one sort of can practice that a little bit longer, then perhaps it becomes a little easier over time or more sustainable over time. I don't know if it's easier per se, but um, awesome. So I have another question. So what advice would you have for maybe people with ADHD who, or or perhaps have difficulty concentrating, kind of sitting still? And they want to start a meditation practice or quiet mindfulness practice. How would you advise them to go forward, or how to get started?
Yeah, this is something I hear more and more lately is that we're ADHD is we're becoming more aware of it.
Mhm.
In society, there's more and more people realizing that they are living with ADHD, and trying to figure out how to manage that in their lives. And it can seem really hard to do any contemplative practice when you're dealing with that. That being said, there is a lot of research around it showing again that a contemplative practice, a mindfulness practice can actually help with ADHD. I think that this is where I love the in the moment practices because they're so short. I'm only needing to bring my attention back for a moment at a time, and I'm not having to sit still. Movement practices are really helpful in this situation as well. There's the idea of walking meditation, where one is moving as they're being mindfulness. Walking meditation can be brought into the day. As you're moving from one space to the other, can you be putting your attention into your feet for one or two or three steps? And then you're moving at the time, which is really helping people focus. Um, Again, I should be writing names down because I end up having mind blocks when I'm on a webinar. But there are some mindfulness instructors and teachers who have ADHD themselves and who are living with ADHD who talk a lot about how they manage it. So probably just a quick Google of mindfulness and ADHD will bring up some of those resources. So mindfulness is helpful in managing it, and it's very easy to adapt your practice. Um, Mindfulness practice can look a lot of different ways, and it doesn't have to look like that person sitting cross-legged. That's why I actually had the picture of the gnome sitting cross-legged, because it's just such a cliche in a way,
Yeah,
but that's not how mindfulness needs to look.
yeah. Thank you for that because yes, I feel like that's something that a lot of people can be struggling with the ability or uh, thinking we have to sit still when that's not necessarily the practice for us at that moment. I do want to point to the chat. We did have a comment from somebody regarding quote difficult patient and how would you recommend approaching that person yet ensuring that we are in that safe zone. So, i.e., not verbally abused, and perhaps that relates a little bit to that kind of question of interconnectedness and the stress of doing that with somebody who is perhaps dysregulated. Um, but do you have anything more to say on that?
Yeah, so I'm going to assume that's the idea that you've walked into a room and um, you're faced with a patient who might be really angry for some reason or really dysregulated for some reason. I mean, first off, again, making sure you're safe. I certainly spent years working in the emergency department, and there were times where I actually left the room and said to somebody, until you've settled, I'll come back once you're settled. Again, assuming that the person is not bleeding out and they don't need to be attended to immediately. Um, the next piece is one, recognizing why they're dysregulated. In my current work, I deal with a lot of people who have had a lot of healthcare trauma and understanding that they're walking into a space where they don't trust me. And I get that. Sometimes just sitting and listening to them can be helpful. Them realizing that they don't need to dysregulate me. So noticing if I'm starting to get a bit defensive, getting my back up, and then taking a strategy to regulate myself and try to sit with them, keeping myself as regulated as possible. And hopefully, my being in that presence and staying regulated can eventually help regulate them. Um, Sometimes, if somebody is open to it, I might actually, this is maybe less with the angry patient, but somebody who's very anxious, I'll actually walk them through a breathing practice. I'll just say, let's take a moment to breathe together. Let's take a moment together to come into this space. If I feel that that person might be open to that, so that then they're in a better situation for us to have that conversation. Um, and also just recognizing what's important to them and looking at how can we get there with them. It might not be, they may have an idea of how they can get their need met. And if I can identify that need, maybe I don't agree with how to get there. Maybe I can offer another option, but recognize what it is that they're trying to meet. And often it is around safety, trust, that type of thing. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. One other thing I know, Shireen, that you talk a lot about in terms of the health structures and health, settings, is moral injury. And somebody did ask in the chat, can you talk a little bit more about recognizing and addressing moral injury, and perhaps even as somebody who if a physician or a healthcare worker feels kind of squeezed by both ends, right? The patient, wanting something from them, and administration or regulations, or the state wanting another thing for them, and feeling there's not a lot of wiggle room. How would somebody kind of recognize and address that moral injury piece?
Probably the subject of a whole nother webinar.
Right.
Very topical right now, as I know so many clinicians are facing more and more um, possibilities for moral injury as we move into this new space. I think so. I think moral injury, first of all, to define it, it's this idea that I know what needs to happen, what the right thing is to happen, and there is something that is blocking me from allowing that to or from enabling that to happen. And that can be a regulation, it could be a lack of resources. Um, I quoted Wendy Dean. She's done a lot of work in this area if people are interested in it. Cinda Rushton out of Johns Hopkins has also done a lot of work. I think from what I've seen, the most important thing is actually naming it, realizing when I'm feeling uncomfortable with something, when I'm feeling myself distress, that it is coming from moral injury. And this idea that, you know, understanding that I have some very deeply held values and something is um, not allowing me to act upon those values. So identifying when it's moral injury, identifying what my values are, and then thinking about, okay, what is the right action for me in this situation that is in line with my values? And I also saw a recent article actually in the Journal of American Medical Association that sort of talked about public health and coming back to our why, coming back to values and saying what's our line in the sand. Um, and that is an important part of moral injury because, we need to identify how can we continue to work in the way that is right for us. And that's all not always an easy answer. But I guess the first step on that question around moral injury is knowing when we can define it, knowing what's happening, and then being able to take some time, come back into regulation, one, so that we're responding and not reacting, and then knowing that we're aligned with our values. That's a really short answer to an incredibly complicated question.
Yeah, there's no way in a two minute left or a couple minutes left that we have here to do that. But perhaps that's a good feedback for webinar for the future. I would love to get more of your thoughts on that. Um, I think perhaps we will leave it right there for now. I do have a couple quick things to remind folks as we wrap up here. But first, I do want to say thank you again, Shireen. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for sharing so much of the knowledge that you've gained. I know you've studied compassion and practiced it in the clinic and academically for a long time. So we really appreciate your help and your guidance here. Thank you, everybody. We have a couple minutes, and I just want to get some quick announcements out to you all. So a couple brief things as we wrap up here. So we will be adding our webinar summary sheet into the chat. So it should be coming through via link, and so that's going to take you to a place on our CI website. You'll be able to access the takeaways document there. So yes, so be on the lookout for that. We are also going to be adding a survey link into the chat. So feedback is always useful for us. We'd love to get your thoughts on how you took this presentation and what we could do in the future to meet your needs. So it's quick survey, 1 to 2 minutes. Please fill that out as you're able. We really appreciate that. If you enjoyed today's webinar, we are so glad because there's going to be another one. This next one's going to be Thursday, May 8th, 2025 at 3 p.m. Pacific time. So there's a little bit of time to plan, put that on your calendars. The theme around that webinar is going to be discussing compassion in medicine at a community health clinic. And so that's going to be specific to within the context of community health center here in the United States in Arizona. So we're really pleased for that. We hope you'll join us for that as well. And finally, if you were interested in all the sorts of tools that Shireen brought up, and if you work in the health field, and we encourage you to check out our brand new course. First time this is going to be rolled out. It's going to be really exciting. That's called Compassion Cultivation in Healthcare. Shireen's going to be facilitating that course that she created. And it's going to be happening in October 2025. So there's still time to plan for that. Signups are now open. We anticipate a good amount of interest for that one. So if you're interested, if you'd like more questions, reach out to us. Otherwise, that signups are open there for that course in October. I think that does it for us. Thanks again for joining us. We will see you soon and be well. Thank you, folks.